Okay, it's all yours, Dr. Brooke.
All right, thank you so much. All right, let's see if I can get it started. Are y'all able to see the screen? Awesome. All right, well, again, like Dr. Lee said, thank everyone so much for being here. I know it's a challenging time, and I hope you find something interesting in what I have to say today. All right, so the title of my talk probably captured your attention, and this was on purpose. Your initial reaction to the question itself, why don't people die, was probably, but they do. And you're correct. As the famous quote by Benjamin Franklin goes, nothing in this world is certain except death and taxes. And I agree, at least in part with this quote, death is certain. Such a statement might bring up some anxiety for you. That's normal. I have just made your mortality salient. So the mortality of everyone in this talk today has been made salient, very salient. In certain cultures, people seem to avoid talking about death. For example, in the United States, this question, along with many others, have been the focus of a project in my cognition and psycholinguistics research lab. And we refer to this project as talking about death. If other people don't want to talk about death, that's fine, but we will. At this point in time, the project is focused on investigating factors that might have an influence on the type of language that people will produce when put in a situation where talking about death can't be avoided. So during this talk, I will touch on some of the primary findings that we have in this area. I will also focus, but I'll actually focus most of my time on explaining how we got here and how it fits into an area of research that I am finding myself drawn to more and more. Let's see. So, as many of you know, my general interest in psychology comes from a broad cognitive perspective. I'm generally interested in how the human mind works, but I'm specifically interested in the role that language plays across all cognitive processes. That being said, there are many different aspects of language that one could study. So, cognitive researchers, for example, have found interesting effects related to the way that people process speech sounds. For example, there's a phenomenon known as phonemic restoration, in which, under certain circumstances, sounds that are absent from a speech signal are perceived as being present in the speech signal. In other words, participants experiencing this phonemic restoration effect report hearing a sound that isn't really there. It's an example of how our guesses or predictions about what is happening in the world can be experienced as real to us, even though they're just guesses or predictions. But my research has never really focused on phonological processing. Cognitive researchers have also found interesting effects related to syntax. So even when the basic information that we're giving people is held constant, packaging this information in different ways can actually change what information people think is factual and what information they think is opinion-based. So I'll walk through one example where you're pretty much talking about the same thing, and the phrase is just structured in different ways. So I could say something like, the orchestra was amazing. Or I could say, the orchestra, which was amazing, and then continue on with my sentence. Or I could say, the amazing orchestra. And in all of these, I'm sort of conveying the same type of idea. But what we find is that the structure of how I have put those together can change whether people think that what I've said is factual or what I've said is opinion based. And so the linguistic packaging seems to be able to distort the way that people interpret the meanings of these phrases. But again, my research has never really focused on syntax. So what am I interested in? Well, primarily the meanings tied to words, the study of which is referred to as semantics. Why? Well, the following quote summarizes my perspective. And it comes from the character of Dumbledore in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying it. And it is this aspect of words and the meanings we associate with them that really intrigues me. So, under what circumstances do words change the way we think about or interact with our world? As the famous lines from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet go, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet." But is this portion of Juliet's soliloquy true? Imagine smelling a real world version of this flower after being told that it was called a candy rose, or a peppermint rose, or a bloody rose. Do you think the way you perceive the scent of the flower might change based on the label being used to describe it? Well, to my knowledge, there isn't really any answer in research that we have to this question. But there is research that supports a more general claim that, at least under certain circumstances, words can have an influence on our perceptions, our memories, and our decisions. Oh, by the way, this rose is actually called a Neil diamond. So I'll provide you with some examples from the literature on words used to describe a person's race to demonstrate some of the ways in which words can have an influence on our perceptions, our memories, and our decisions. So in the case of perceptions, research led by Erica Hall at Emory University investigated whether white Americans perceive the word African American to be more favorable than the word Black. The researchers conducted several different experiments in which they manipulated which word was being used to describe a person. In one of their experiments, they presented participants with a fictional crime report to see whether a criminal suspect would be perceived more negatively when they were identified as Black as compared to African American. The result? White participants showed more negative emotions toward a suspect when they read that a Black male suspect was found running east on Lake Street, so on and so forth, than when the same suspect was described using the word African American. I have my notes rigged up on a not very, it's a rigged system, so hopefully it'll stay put. All right. In the case of memories, research led by Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford University investigated whether using the words Black or white as part of a description of a person could change people's memory for a photograph of that person. So participants in this experiment were asked to memorize demographic information about a person. The information they were given included either the word Black or the word white as a description of the person's race. They were then presented with a face of racially ambiguous people or a racially ambiguous person, excuse me, for 10 seconds, and were asked to remember it for later. After participants played an unrelated game for 2 minutes, they were then asked to recall as much of the demographic information as they were able. Then they were shown 2 images and were asked to pick the one that they saw earlier. But participants never saw either of those images previously. Participants who were given the word Black were more likely to choose the photo with the more stereotypical Black features. Those given the word white were more likely to choose an image with a more stereotypical white facial features. Now, this pattern of results in which the word has an effect on memory only occurred when participants reported believing that genetic traits are permanent and cannot change. In other words, they were categorized as entity theorists. If participants reported believing that genetic traits are malleable and can change and were classified as incremental theorists, then they didn't show these types of um, assimilating language into their memory of the image. And this is consistent with previous research, which has shown that these types of words can that not these types of words in particular, but that trait labels, so information about people, can lead entity theorists to focus on trait relevant and expectancy consistent information. So they're more likely to rely on things like stereotypes when making decisions and processing information in their environment. In the case of decision making, Bertrand and Lafayette conducted a field experiment to investigate racial discrimination in hiring practices. The researchers responded to help wanted ads with fictitious resumes. Each resume was assigned either a name that people tend to associate with African American people or a name that people tend to associate with white people. The results showed a significant discrimination against African American names. White names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. And there were other results that also supported this claim. Unfortunately, even employers who said they were an equal opportunity employer in their ads discriminated as much as other employers who did not have this description in their ads. These results, although specific to words used to describe someone's race or skin tone, provide clear examples of how words, or really the meanings we have tied to words, can interact with a variety of cognitive processes. But I started off this presentation talking about death and the words we use or don't use when talking about death. So why is a cognitive scientist like myself interested in death-related language? Well, as many of you know, I help to facilitate children's grief support groups, first as a volunteer, then as a group director at Healing House, Hope for Grieving Children, a local nonprofit here in Lafayette, for over 10 years. Our training materials stress the importance of using direct, literal language to talk about death. That really piqued my interest. Why? Well, because at the time, I was focused on studying the semantics of metaphor. In other words, the opposite of literal language. Also, when people are put in situations where talking about death cannot be avoided, they often use metaphors and other types of figurative language. So this really intrigued me. All right, so what am I talking about here? Well, as an example, one of my research lab's original studies on this topic asked college students at UL Lafayette, how might you, your friends, or your family members say that someone has died without using the word die? What we were hoping is that people would give us these metaphors and figurative uses of language that they would use to describe what we used a literal term to talk about, right? Die. Well, one participant gave us the following: passed away, is gone, moved on, has left us, moved on to a better place, gone to the upper room, in heaven with the angels. And so you may have heard some of these before being used to describe a person who has died or a person who is dying. Another participant said, oh, and my share screen covers the middle one. Let me see if I can see it. Passed away, no longer with us, and with another person who has died. So like with grandmother, right? Another participant said, looking down on you now, passed away, went to heaven, pain-free now. So we got lots and lots of different and varied responses from participants. And what this shows us is the wide variety of figurative language that people have available to them when talking about the topic of death. So now I want to return to a question that I asked earlier in the presentation. Is avoidance of death as a topic of conversation related to anxiety about death? And add on to that, is the use of metaphors when talking about death a way of avoiding or evading the topic in some way? What's the answer? Well, we don't know yet. This is such an underexplored area of research. So what's out there? Well, researchers such as Koopman, Holm, and Tsai have looked at the language used in things like sympathy cards. And what they did was they found evidence to suggest that across American and German cultures, there is a difference in expressions of sympathy in these sympathy cards, with Americans more likely to avoid negative language than Germans. So that's really interesting, but there's not a ton of research in this area. Another interesting finding comes from researchers such as McClellan and colleagues who have looked at the ways that people conceptualize metaphors and have found correlations between how people conceptualize death, their death anxiety, and their degree of religious affiliation. Well, what do they find? Participants who prefer negative conceptualizations of death, such as viewing death as like a cold and lonely journey, were more likely to have higher anxiety about death, and participants with a higher degree of religious affiliation were more likely to prefer positive conceptualizations of death, such as viewing death as a homecoming. So these are different individual difference factors that we see having an impact on the way that people are tending to conceptualize or think about death as a concept. No one really has looked into the production of death-related words by individuals and the factors that might influence the words that they produce. And what we really don't know is what words individuals will use in situations where talking about death cannot be avoided. And that's where my lab's current research comes into play. All right, so what my research lab is currently working on to address this topic is part of a larger project. And this part of the project has actually been funded by a UL Lafayette undergraduate research mini grant. What we're doing is we are currently exploring the words that people use when they talk about death and are starting off this exploratory research by investigating a convenient sample of college students, so using the SONA subject pool. We present participants, so what we've done so far is we are presenting participants with the following instructions. Imagine that you are from a small town and that one of your close friends, who happens to be female, is volunteering abroad. The only way to contact them is via email. While they are on the trip, their mother dies in a car accident because they failed to stop at a red light. You know that you should inform your friend of the situation, so you decide to write to them. To maintain confidentiality, please refrain from using your last name at any point in the email. After 4 minutes of writing, you'll be given the option to continue. So we put people in a situation where talking about death cannot really be avoided. And what we want to see is what they say in this context. how do they refer to what has happened to the mother. The participants' emails are essentially being used to create what in language research we call a corpus. And it's providing us with information about the language that people are using when they have to convey information about the death of a person. We then asked people in the same study about things like their personal experiences with death. So if they've ever experienced the death of a mother or a father or a grandmother or a grandfather, and how old they were at the time of these experiences, like the youngest age that they've had that type of experience, and how impactful that experience was for them. We also asked participants about their degree of fear of death. So how much do they fear different aspects of death and dying? We asked about their degree of spirituality. So how connected do they feel to the spiritual world? And we also asked about their afterlife beliefs. So what do they think happens after someone has died? Now, our initial results are showing that less than half of the participants, um, given the instructions that I just read to you, are using literal death-related language to describe a death that has happened. So I think it's about 37% of participants are using literal death-related language. Everyone else is avoiding those words and are using figurative language or metaphors in its place. Our initial results are also showing that a significant factor in the words being used by participants is their degree of spirituality. And this is actually consistent with the previous research that I mentioned earlier, where we asked people, what do you, your friends, your family say, instead of died? We got very similar results where the individual difference factor that stuck out the most and was the best predictor, right, of what people would say ended up being related to spirituality. So this is really interesting, and we're looking forward to exploring it in more depth. So what about that question I brought up earlier? Is avoidance of death as a topic of conversation related to anxiety about death? Well, we don't have any evidence in our current data set to suggest that this is the case. We're not done collecting data though, so we really don't have a clear determination on this, but it's interesting that we're not seeing a trend in that direction. Once we have a better understanding of the types of death-related language that people are likely to produce, we are then going to turn our efforts to looking at comprehension. Previous research in my lab shows that literal death-related words, such as death, died, dying, tend to be rated more negatively, like they make people sad or angry or some sort of other negative emotion, than life-related words, such as life, lived, living, which are rated more positively, right? They tend to make people happier or joyous. However, what we have not tested is whether certain death-related language is perceived by people as more comforting or maybe less anxiety provoking than other types of death-related language. And we also, of course, haven't explored what role individual differences would play in this perception process, right? This comprehension process. And I'm really excited about the future of this research project. Okay. So sorry that I didn't fill up the whole time, but hopefully we have lots of time for questions. But I did want to thank everyone for listening. And I also wanted to just put it out there that my research lab is always inviting people to apply. We're always looking for student researchers to get involved with the different types of research we have going on. And this is one of those projects. We have other projects too that similarly sort of focus typically on the semantics of words.
Great. Thank you so much. So let's move to question. I see that Melanie has a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? That was awesome. That was such a great presentation.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I was really interested to see all of that data. So I have a 4-year-old son, and we have been very open. I've had 3 grandparents die since he was born, and his cat died. So we started really young when he was like around 1.5 or 2, just saying they died, you know? And I think that I was interested to hear that it has to do with spirituality to some extent, because like I was raised Jewish, but our spiritual beliefs are definitely atheist. But also I was just wondering, like, so what have you seen, because you said you work with kids, right? And how does the literal affect them versus like using more vague concepts?
Yeah, so I don't know that anyone's people have definitely done research in the area, but looking at that specific question, I don't know if we have like data about whether like children are positively or negatively affected by the use of literal death terms. But anecdotally, what you hear in the training materials and what I've experienced personally is that when you use those literal terms, it's clear what you are talking about. And maybe at the age of 3, right, it isn't clear yet, but they have a term that they can start to add information and meaning to. And, you know, it's very clear that's what this refers to. Versus if I use some figurative language, like some people talk about it as like death as the big sleep, like, well, they're asleep, or, you know, they're in heaven, or you say things like we buried the body. And all of these things to us as adults is like, yeah, of course. Okay, that makes sense. But to children, they can interpret these in wildly different ways that tend to be very literal in nature, right? So, you know, I remember the idea of, you know, a child being just distraught because they didn't understand where their person's head was because the body was buried. Yeah. So just, you know, I think we lose perspective sometimes as adults on how important it is to talk to children, you know, because we say these things and we just assume that maybe they understand, like we understand what's being referred to. If you talk about death as sleep, right, if that's the metaphor that you choose to use, a lot of times those children are terrified to go to bed at night. And the surviving parents wonder, why is this? Right? Why is this happening? Why won't they sleep? And it's like, I understand, you know, they're grieving, but this needs, you know, I need sleep too. And it's because of their understanding of, you know, what the information that we're giving them. So, but I would be interested. I don't think I've done a lit search for that in a while though. So it'd be interesting to see if, you know, researchers have followed up on that and actually looked at the effects, because I know that is at least in grief support group settings for children, the materials we use for training are used nationwide. So, you know, I think there's a lot of data out there in these grief support groups that could be tapped into. Oh, I think you mentioned another thing too. Sorry, Melanie, I don't want to cut you off, but about the experiencing the death of a pet. That was something really interesting in our data. So we asked about people's experiences with death. And one of the things that sticks out is that almost everyone had an experience that of the death of a pet, and they typically marked it as extremely impactful, regardless of the age they were when it happened. So when they had that first experience. And I think this is an overlooked area of kind of grief support, that we could be doing a better job of reaching children and talking them through this experience, because they seem to be impacted by it, right? These are college students saying, yes, I remember that, and it impacted the way I think about, you know, death. And so we found that really fascinating. Definitely want to follow up on it.
That's all very interesting. So I'm glad to hear that it's not destroying him, probably, because some people have been like, wow, that's really, really forward of you. But I've always just, I don't know, I didn't want him to get confused.
Yeah.
You know, so because it is very confusing. And I grew up, I'm very lucky. I didn't have much death in my life. But my parents were straightforward with us usually. But he knew all of my grandparents very well. And the cat was like his best friend. And so we just decided really early that that's what we were going to do. But yeah, I don't think he grasped it fully, because he still asked what it was all the time. But we told him like, oh, like they're gone and they're not coming back, and you remember them, and you know. So.
And that's the same exact things that we would do during our support group settings too, is just remind, like, especially the young ones, right? They're going to repeatedly ask the same questions over and over. And if we're going to be helpful in the process, we're going to answer the questions over and over and over. And eventually, right, they come to associate the two and have a better understanding. But it's really only through time and experience, right, that we really come to understand what this thing is.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Excuse me, Brooke.
Yes, Patrick.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had not really thought about this, and so this is kind of off the top of my head, but in terms of dealing with kids and in terms of their perspective and attitudes about hope versus maybe being not as hopeful. And I was listening to what Melanie was saying a moment ago and just wondering, in terms of progressive proceeding with life and the way they think about life and about whether or not it impact. I'm not, as I'm thinking about it, Melanie, from your perspective a little bit, because I've never really thought about it that way. But I'm wondering whether or not the language that is used will play a part in the adjustment, the positivity versus maybe feeling neutral, or just kind of maybe kind of blah about things, whether or not, and developmentally, whether or not that has an impact on the individual in terms of attitude, degree of positivity versus even keel responses to things. And again, not really sure how to formulate the question, just thinking out loud as we go. But have you what might you say related to kids who have been relayed information from different perspectives in terms of the way that it impacts their mood and their perspectives progressively going forward? Can you say anything about that?
Well, so what I can say is I don't think there's a lot of research on that, if any. And that I think one of the things I would point to is sort of our findings on related to spirituality, and that especially in like a population like the one that we live in, that seems to be a very important factor, right? What we don't know though is what effect that has, right, when it's used. But I also think we could tie in some of that cross-cultural research that has been conducted that is looking at how the language sort of gives us insight into how that culture perceives death and handles death. Now, that research doesn't really talk about whether one is better or worse, right? Whether there are are people coping with death in productive ways, or are they having negative coping experiences. So I don't think we know that, but that would be the way that I would kind of approach it, is from that idea that we know that different people can talk about these things in different ways. And I agree that it would be interesting to see what effects that has on children, but I think it's going to be very similar to like the cross-cultural research. It's just that the cultures are within like what we think of as a single culture, but we might have those who are very spiritual in nature, right? Or who grew up in a spiritual household, right? And versus those who maybe did not grow up in that type of environment. And I think that we're likely to see differences potentially in the way that they respond to different types of language, just like we see the differences between cultures. I would say though, the one factor that I'm aware of having a big impact on children and their ability to cope with death or their grief is connections. So connections with others, and having like a support system. And I almost think that might be the role that spirituality plays for a lot of people. And so it's like it serves as a support system for someone who is going through a difficult time, and that support system is what they're going to pull from if they're going to be resilient. So I would say children without that kind of support system, and maybe in a family, for example, like you're thinking, who doesn't talk about death, like you don't say that, right? You don't talk about that topic. That's rude. That's not pleasant. And we just hide it. And thinking that may eliminate kind of a part of that support system that they could have, like a language to use to describe the things that they're experiencing, versus, if they grew up in a household where it was okay to talk about, right? Then you can think of that as having like more of a connected support system. But obviously this is me again, like responding to you, like you were thinking off the top of your head. This is me thinking off the top of my head.
I understand. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. So next, I saw that Dr. Michael has raised his hand for very long. I'm afraid that he will be tired. So let's have Dr. Michael ask his question.
Yeah. Thanks, Brooke, for a great talk. I really don't know how to ask this question because it's just some stuff that came into my head while you were speaking. So apologies if this makes no sense at all. But I'm wondering, it relates to the idea of people's spiritual beliefs and how they talk about death. And so I'm wondering, is there a question here about the understanding of the language that people are using when they describe death? So for example, two people give the same language when they're describing the death of somebody, but for one person, that language could be purely metaphorical and they would understand that it's just a metaphor. but for somebody else, they might mean it literally based on their spiritual beliefs. So I'm just, again, I don't really know what the question I have here is, but would you be interested in maybe asking people, what do you really mean when you say these words? Like, do you mean it literally, or is this just a metaphor to make things smoother for the description?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I hadn't thought of it until you were saying it, because for so long, I think I've come at this from sort of how linguists approach this problem, which is like, we categorize these things as metaphor and, figurative language, and we categorize these things as literal. But you're right in that there could be language, like someone is in heaven, that for many people is essentially literal, right? That is an accurate description of where someone is, in whatever form, that might be. So no, but that's fascinating. And I think that would be, I'm going to add that in to my notes for future research. We have looked a little at when death is used, like the word itself, or like death related words are used in like metaphorical context. So totally different from what you were talking about, but sort of this interesting potential connection between everything. So if I'm like, oh, I'm dying of thirst, right? People are totally fine with others saying that, right? We don't typically have the same type of reaction that we do to the use of the term in a literal context, right?
That's
and so I found that really fascinating, and it really sticks out to you in the support group setting with bereaved children as how much we do this. And it's just, we don't realize that we're using these terms, to describe these things. It's just, it's probably, partially habitual, right? That we've just used it so much in this way that it means this particular thing, and we don't necessarily, dissect it into its component parts, like maybe we did when the first time, we heard it, or the first time we used it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Great. Next question. Dr. Schatz?
I'll do my video. Brooke, I just wanted to congratulate you and compliment you on a great talk. As you were talking, particularly about that employment aspect, I'm like, that is so true. But what I take away with is I thought of Dr. Maya Angelou, who's one of my favorite authors, and she kind of close to the end of her life, she was talking about the power of words, and that words do have power. And she explicitly stated that it's hard for us to quantify that power. But it seems like as a cognitive and psychologist and a linguistic person, that you're making some. Oh. Is that Patrick? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to say that it looks like you're on the way of quantifying that. And just to kind of echo what Robert Michael was saying, those of you who do know me, I am a spiritual person, and I'm also African American. And I could tell you in my culture, there's this major emphasis on words like homegoing. And if you're extremely spiritual, even when they're doing the service, it's all about, not figuratively speaking, but literally you're going to a better place and you're going to see your relatives. And so it's like when people say that, it's like really literal. So it would be interesting to add that spiritual component to that fact.
Yeah, it seems very relevant. Yeah, it's interesting picking up on that spiritual component too, and the idea that words have power, because I was looking for, some interesting quotes and to get inspired. And it turns out that a lot of charismatic Christians like that this is part of their like what they put out there in the world, is this idea that words have power.
Yeah.
And so I found that just fascinating because, you know, all the videos like on YouTube, if you search that, are all charismatic Christian, you know, ministries talking about this issue. So I found that really fascinating too.
2 quick points I want to add. You know, I'm thinking about obituaries. Like, rarely do I see the term obituary. It's like homegoing. So there's this major push. And we'll talk outside of this meeting, but if you want to look at more employment stuff and words, and because when you tell it to people, people really wouldn't admit, particularly if they're in human resources, I'm trying to do the fair thing, we're an equal employment you know, employer. But just that word from Black to African American, if you were to tell that to maybe an average person, like that would make a difference, an employment difference. It's like, no way. But it does. So we'll talk.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. I know that in at least in applied settings, like medical settings, that oftentimes I've been witness at presentations we talked about notifications, and they oftentimes the presentation was very didactic, very much like, this is how you want to do a death notification. These are things that could go wrong. Have you run across any death notifications to have death, or is this all just clinical that's being packed in this gospel within the medical community?
Yeah, I mean, medical literature often needs type of perspective. I, at least personally, haven't come across any data on that. I have seen anecdotal reports of like when medical professionals talk amongst themselves, they use a lot of figurative language that is very harsh in talking about these things. And, you know, the idea is that it potentially helps them cope. So they have different terms that they might use to describe different types of patients that they would never want their patients to hear them say, because they're kind of, you know, crude in nature. So I have come across things like that, but again, just anecdotal. Like I don't think there were any statistics, you know, applied. I don't think they collected data. I think it was just like, I've seen this in this setting. Here are some examples.
Yeah. I think it sounds like the little we know about a lot of this stuff, not just death notification, is there are a lot of stories, a lot of case study sort of observations where people theorize about what's going on. But like you said, big, huge gaps in what's actually been studied in any kind of quantifiable empirical sense.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping to bring together, at least from the perspective of the words that we're using, you know, is to kind of combine all these disparate literatures and hopefully, you know, start in this direction of a better understanding of how we can use language. Because eventually, you know, my hope is that we can sort of like the context that you're talking about, we can understand more of how our language is going to affect someone when we talk about death, and then make the best choices about like how we train people, you know, in these fields.
Yeah, it's definitely like that whole issue came up because I got notified of my dad's death while teaching this semester. While I was doing a Zoom presentation, my sister called and confirmed that my dad was in fact dead in front of 45 witnesses. So, you know, those kinds of events, I think, and the language around it and the context it must have like a significant impact on where we place it in our memory, what we associate it with, and ultimately maybe even influencing the meaning of that particular event.
I think so.
Yeah, Dr. Santos?
Yeah, my question actually just kind of, I think y'all touched on it. One of the things that I'm sort of constantly thinking about, I think anytime people are talking about words having power, is that, couldn't we predict that words would have different kinds of power, different kinds of effects in different contexts? So if I'm speaking, if I'm a nurse and I'm speaking with another nurse and I'm kind of using my words fast and loose, that might strike me differently than if I walk into a room and a family member uses that same kind of language. So I just wanted to ask the extent to which, I guess that's one of your interests, is sort of contextual control and that kind of layer of it, and how that might, we might have differential impacts of words in different circumstances.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a consideration. I mean, obviously we had to construct, a sort of scenario to get people to actually tell us, some words that they might use in a situation regarding death. And so we definitely thought a lot about like why this scenario. We also think that what our hope is in the future to change aspects of that scenario and see kind of what happens. So I think at a very low level perspective, we've definitely considered that. So one of the things that we're definitely thinking about changing is the gender of the person who died, the gender of the person who you're writing the letter to, that sort of thing. And of course, also thinking about, well, what implications would, if we change that and that changes the language, then what if the whole context changes, right? What do we expect based on those findings? So, and I'm thinking that we're probably going to find some effects of changing those different pieces and getting different types of language being used.
I'm thinking about listener functions as well. Like if I hear something, if I hear you use a word to describe death in this one context versus in this other context, like how that will impact me, how I will experience it. I think, I'm always interested in little spots in other disciplines where it feels like people are approaching things really mechanistically, and sort of me saying is there always it depends on the context.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those spots where it's it feels like a lot would depend on people's learning history with those particular words in those particular situations. And we might be able to train people to respond in ways that are more effective or adaptive to the words they're going to hear anyway. For example. So yeah, this is so exciting. It's such a fun area. I mean, it's, death and stuff, but as fun as death can get.
Exactly. No, that's what I think the members of my research lab might agree. We know people see us as weirdos, but it's okay because it's really interesting. And somebody needs to do the research.
Great. Any last questions? Nope. Thank you so much, Dr. Breaux. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure all of us do. Awesome work. And thank you so much for spending time to tell us your research. Really appreciate that. And I'm sure if others have questions, y'all could, just contact
Yes,
Dr.
please
Breaux.
email me. I'd be happy to talk. Some of you had some really great ideas. So if you didn't say anything, but you have a great idea, send it my way.
Yep. Great. And just a final note, if you have logged into the meeting earlier, you should have seen this. So mark your day for our next semester, Brown back. So have a good break. And we'll see one another next semester, if not earlier. See y'all. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.